So thank you very much to both John and Chris, who are going to talk a little bit about what it means to be a full-time supervisor for full-time employees and professionalism around social media. So maybe I'll have each one of them do a quick introduction just to talk about their role and where they are at their institution, and then we'll start with some questions. So Chris, do you want to start?
Absolutely. My name is Sewalish, and I'm the Associate Director for Administration here at Michigan State University.
John Birnbaum, Associate Vice President for Student Services, Western Illinois University.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for being willing to do this. I imagine we're going to have some great conversation and a few laughs thrown in between. But I thought I would sort of start with one of the questions around how do you use your social media accounts and what do you hope to accomplish through your social media presence? Is it personal? Is it professional? Do you see a mix of both?
Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you. Well, I think it's a tough question to answer to a certain degree because in the work that we do, the professional really is personal and vice versa. And when we talk about concepts of professionalism within that, we also need to remember professionalism is a pretty loaded term, and it has quite a bit of baggage to it. I think it's up to people individually how they want to use their social media, but it's really wise to be informed about what do my impacts look like and how I use it. And those were some questions that I probably imperfectly asked myself early on in my social media journey. It's really changed dramatically in the last 5 years. I was very active on Twitter, very active on Facebook, and it really blended both of my identities, my personal and my professional. And again, while there's no realistic divide there, at this point in time, I think that I've moved away from my initial goal. My initial goal was I want to engage with lots of people in the field. I want to engage in great dialogues and conversations, and I really want to make clear my values and who I am and what I do. As my positions have changed and my roles have changed, I've come to realize that, staff members, parents, families, students, those I interact with and make decisions with and for may read that and read into why or how I make a certain decision. And what matters to me most is their perception of objectivity and how I do things. And again, that's a choice that's really good for me. I was able to meet some great people and make some really good friends, long-lasting friendships that have actually made my time in housing and the association that much better and more fruitful. That said, I didn't want to put my team or a parent or student or guardian in a position to doubt my commitment to their student. And it was easier to pull away from that and make it a little bit more private for me, just stylistically. So I use social media now predominantly for pictures of friends and family and engaging with my interests. I've actually have a pretty big wall between myself and, I guess, student affairs social media. But again, that just works for me in my time and place. When I was into it, I was very engaged and I took a lot of great things from it. I think right now it's really more focused on my personal.
I'm all over the board. And listen, I've been in this field 25 years, so I probably represent the older end of people that are on social media a lot, I guess. And so where I started and where I'm at now is probably pretty different. I really believe in connection, and I think the best parts of social media allow you to make those connections and keep connections that maybe you otherwise wouldn't have. I do know people that have a personal Facebook account and a professional Facebook account. That's not where I'm at. I sort of am a gray area person and blend those all together. Like Chris, I probably lean a little more towards, in the end, if you were doing by percentage, it's probably more personal than professional for me. But I would say that it has been a helpful professional tool for me. Even in when I think about holding positions in a QOI like NHTI faculty recruitment, I'm able to reach a much bigger audience faster and get more views than I would be able to otherwise. And I think that I've seen success in that particular endeavor. I would tell you from a fundraising standpoint, whether it's doing a Parthenon, not a Parthenon, that's not a good example, but whether you're fundraising back on campus or for Glakuo or for the region or for something like that, that's also a good vehicle to do that stuff professionally. But I also think that it's a way for people to show who they are authentically. I tell people all the time, if you accept a Facebook friendship with me, I'm an overposter. You're going to see a lot of dog and animal videos. You're going to see a lot of stuff from Western Illinois University because I love this place, and I feel like it's a good way for me to promote it. And then you may see some other stuff. I don't try to get too crazy on it. I try to be positive, but and I'm also not a person. If you ask me to be your friend on one of these things or connect with me, there's like a 99% chance I'm probably going to say yes. I don't have a big wall as Chris probably does. If people can see me authentically or they can't, that's up to them how they want to view me. And what I put out there, I'm comfortable with.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate the reflections from both of you. And I think you both have sort of maybe given some good ideas and some good thoughts for folks that are maybe watching this in terms of thinking about what's their philosophy and their values about how they sort of see social media. And I think it's also helpful to hear what some of your journeys have been and how you tend to use social media and maybe what some of the boundaries are. And I know for myself over the years, I probably am a little more on social media than I used to be, but also at the same time, given my role at my institution in particular, because I oversee the Veterans Office as well, I'm also very cognizant about what that means, especially as we're talking about the political space. And so try to think about, like, how do I navigate, I think, both that personal and professional. But I do like seeing people's, pictures of their dogs and their families and what are their trips, because I do like to stay connected with people. Because for me, we do make a lot of lasting friendships in this profession, but oftentimes it's with people that are far away. And so I do see it as a value, but I'm also very cognizant for myself on intent versus impact and what that can look like depending on what I'm posting. So thank you very much for sharing that. We're going to move on to the next question is, do you let students and staff follow you, and why or why shouldn't you do that?
I'll jump in on that. I do let students and staff follow me. My Facebook and Twitter are the Wild West, and I use both those vehicles differently. Twitter's probably more personal for me than Facebook. I use Facebook more professionally, but for somebody that's in an AVP, that's in an office where many students or staff view you as the person that hears appeals, or that's the last person you go to when you've been let go, and you don't have as much daily interaction as a live-in hall director or live-in staff member or even an assistant director, I think it's a way for me to be humanized, that I'm not just the big bad guy in the corner office that worries about budgets and bathrooms and hears appeals. And so I'm good with what I put out there. If I put it out there, then I've vetted it through my own mind that I'm okay with it. And so if students and staff want to see me, they get to see the real me, and I think it humanizes me in my position.
I think it's tough to a certain degree because we answer this question through the lens of a lot of positional privilege to a certain degree. And I think that's why what I put out there has changed, right? Because the stakes can be lower or higher depending upon where we sit in an organization. Also keeping in mind, some campuses and in states have their own social media policies.
Right.
And as I think about that, and I think about how this might be heard by younger professionals, I always try to frame it with the things I do would fall within the rules or guidelines that are given to me by my institution or by the state, or frankly, just by the norms of my institution. I've been at institutions where folks are exceptionally active on social media and some where they're not so much. So to that point, I think it's how I answer this question is probably based upon the culture I'm in or who I'm with. That said, I'll accept a friend request from a student or staff member. I mean, most of what I post is related to things I otherwise say or do on a daily basis, very similar to JB. So I'm really not worried about those things looking incongruent, right? Because when, staff or students start following you, they're not looking for it, but if something seems incongruent, they're going to notice. And chances are they're not going to comment on it and say, gosh, this is incongruent from the conversation or staff meeting we had. I generally don't think it's wise for those engaging in discussions that you wouldn't want to be called out on at work to add folks. You've got to be willing, whatever you put out there, and JB's a great example of this. If I'm willing to talk about this or engage with it and have this conversation. If you can't say it to a team member in person, don't allow them to see it on your social media feed.
Right.
And there's a deeper thing there where if I'm saying you're doing things on social media that I wouldn't say to my team, I should probably check what I'm saying and doing in general. I don't think there's a clear should or should not. I think it comes down to whatever you're willing to answer for. And I know there's, to a certain degree, some folks may see that as inherently unfair. Why should I be called out on this thing that is theoretically not connected to my position? At the end of the day, if you're adding staff or students to your social media feed, you're inviting them in. And I can't expect them to see it as different. I need to own those things. I can't expect them to say, well, that's what he posted there, but he's going to be fine when I meet with them. And I have to sometimes check myself before I post something and to really think, based upon who's there, are they going to hear me in the same way they did before I posted this? That practical note, when you add students or staff, you really open yourself up to potentially see uncomfortable information. So by way of example, if there's a team member regularly posting during a workday that they're at a really, really, really long lunch, or they, are having coffee for an hour and a half in the middle of the day, or maybe they're late for a meeting and they just updated Facebook that they were in a really long line at a coffee shop. You've got to decide if you're comfortable seeing those things, or if you're comfortable knowing those things. And that's something we don't really talk about, is I'm going to see things that may very well impact how I view my team, because these are lifestyle positions ultimately. And those are the things that I try to encourage folks to think about. What are you going to do if you see that? Well, I'm going to ask them about it. So you're going to say you saw it on their Facebook and you're going to ask if that's why they were late to the meeting? What positions are we putting ourselves in? What would HR say? Oh, you saw it on their social media feed. For me, I tend to get into the minutia a little bit too much, and I might be a little too worst case scenario. But I'd rather not end up in those spaces if I don't necessarily have to. So I'll typically wait for, if somebody requests me or I know I have a shared interest, I might request them. But it's ultimately to their comfort level. And what I post tends to be then pretty benign. So if you want to be inundated with, music videos from the early 80s and pictures of my kid or hockey videos, I'm a great Facebook friend. Otherwise, I'm not terribly interesting.
And I think there's a middle ground, Steph. I think there are people that wait until a student or staff member graduates or leaves and then add them at that point. I mean, so I think there's all kinds of ways you can approach it.
Yeah, and I will share that for me, I usually, for students, it's usually after they graduate.
Yeah.
So, and some of that I think is culture at the institution and sort of following the informal, how other folks are doing some of that. But certainly staff, if they want to reach out to me, I don't want anyone to feel like they have to accept a friend request from somebody that I supervise. So I step back and wait for them to initiate it, but will automatically accept it. Right. But certainly other colleagues within the division or the institution. But you're right, it's kind of everybody has to do with what they feel comfortable with and understanding what some of the great consequences are and sometimes maybe some of the unintended ones are. And just out of curiosity, does your institution have an actual social media policy?
Ours does not.
Yeah.
Previous institution did, and it was implemented while I was still there, and that was an interesting thing to watch and see. We don't have a stated social media policy for personal use, though it's a really cool opportunity to get people engaged with our communications department, and it's a really great learning opportunity to say, this is what, by way of example, our communications team manages all day. What a cool example for people to see on how to build a profile, how to be seen, how they want to be seen. So I think it's a great learning opportunity.
I definitely have some accounts that need some updating. I'm not gonna lie, that's a summer project. What does your social media use or visibility tell students and guests and staff about who you are and how you do your job?
Honestly, I post a lot about my family and my personal interests and the occasional thing that I might find interesting that maybe 3 or 4 other people do. It reflects who I am as much as I love a long, thoughtful dialogue, but I'm always focused on being committed to a smaller number of things. And that's something I'm working on quite a bit, is I'm going to focus and zero in on these things, and that's awesome. And I would love to have a great dialogue about it. And it's pretty visible in my social media that I will have a thoughtful conversation. But my hope is that that's ultimately what it conveys when they see it, is wow, those are the things he really likes, and that's cool. And if I have a shared interest there, there's something great to talk about. Otherwise, there's really not anything terribly controversial there. But that works for me.
I'm probably a little different than Chris than that. I mean, certainly, like I said, I'm an over poster. I mean, I post a lot, especially on Facebook. And so you're going to get to see that I care about dogs and animals, and you're going to get to see that I care about my brothers and sisters and the St. Louis Cardinals and in sports. And you're going to get to see Brewers fan Chris. You're going to get to see all that. But there's two other things that I do pretty regularly. Is I'll put stuff out there, whether it's higher ed related or not higher ed related, that I think will spark a discussion. And I have a wide variety of people that follow me across the political spectrum. So I get some good debates going on my news feed sometimes. And I like seeing that because I think it helps me learn where people are at. It helps me develop my opinions and thoughts about things. And I'm not afraid to sort of put some of those things out there that I think will be controversial sometimes, or that I know that people will respond to. And the other thing I've done probably for a couple of years now is several times a week at least, I try to do a hashtag Screw Politics post. And it's a post, it's a positive post about something positive in the world. And I think it's important that happens, because I think that there's a lot of crap on social media. And so it never hurts to infuse it with a little positivity.
Well, and to that point, too, I think that there's a lot of folks who post things and use it as a way to signal what they care about, or at least what they want to tell folks they care about. And that's one of the reasons I appreciate how JB approaches it, because it's typically without comment. And it allows people to have a pretty robust dialogue by and large. I think a lot of folks use social media to kind of raise a flag and say, these are my values and this is what I care about, and I'm going to post this particular piece. And it's a way to signal to other people who might feel the same way.
Right, and I feel like I try not to do that.
Exactly. Well, I think that's what you do a good example. That's what you do a great job of doing, and you serve as an example for that, because oftentimes, as people do kind of that signaling to one another, it's great, but that also doesn't mean that that's how that person engages on a daily basis. It also doesn't mean that that's how they're following through in their work. And it's tough because over the last probably 5 to 8 years in our field, I think a lot of folks have confused really great social media posts with also being great at their work.
Right.
It's very easy to be enamored by some of that. But I always fall back to this place of like, so what does this actually look like when you do it? Like, or it's great to really engage and say, oh, I really believe in this article and what was posted. You know, if I'm going to post a news piece, I'm to that point of like, what does it tell people? I'm going to have researched the source. I'm going to have read it more than once. I'm going to decide whether or not it needs any kind of commentary. And I'm going to make sure whatever it is I'm putting out there is coming from a reliable place and isn't there just to stir the pot. And I would never want folks to confuse me posting something with, oh, that must be the thing he cares the most about, or Chris must be really good at his job because he had a really great Twitter profile. That's where I have a harder time. And I think that it can be easy for folks to be swept up in that if they're not careful.
Absolutely.
Yep. Agree all the way around. So what I would ask you next is, do you have to have social media in your sort of repertoire to be in this profession?
I don't know. I don't think there's a really good answer to that. I think if I were to answer for me, it would be absolutely not. To a degree, I see it as an advantage not to be, because you're able to show up without these preconceived notions based upon what you've posted. So the blank slate helps to a certain degree. You also kind of avoid the rogue student or parent finding you and finding your publicly posted items and maybe using them as a reason to push back. Really to some of what JB said, some do see like building a professional brand online is important, and certainly that fits for some people. But I really think there's a much larger group of professionals out there who are not focused on necessarily branding, and I'm not saying it's bad, I'm saying it's not for me, that are still getting jobs and doing good work and moving up. There's lots of people not engaging in that are really doing great things, and writing for the journal or writing for their professional organization or engaging in amazing and spirited conversations, on the forums. So it kind of, again, goes back to that, like, we need to be very careful in associating good work and success with what we see on social media. So I don't think you need to do it. And I think that ultimately, when you show up with your values being strong in whatever those are, in whatever way, people will see that. So
yeah, I agree. I also think it's not an absolute that you have to be on social media or have a social media presence to be successful in this profession. I do think that you can use it to help build your professional brand, but you have to be very strategic about that if that's what your intent is. And Chris talked about intent earlier and impact. And so I think you really have to think that through. If that's what you're using it for, think that through and what that looks like long term as you're using that as a vehicle to do it. I will tell you, and I would repeat this again, I think it can assist you as a professional for sure. And maybe it's because I do a lot more fundraising things that gives me more visibility. And like in April, we'll do the Day of Giving for Western Illinois University. Well, all of a sudden, there's 2,000 people, Western alum, that I can reach instantaneously that I would have had a much more difficult time doing on that day. And you see in the numbers of the people that give that day that it helps you. So if I wasn't on that, maybe we don't make as much money that day. So do I think it can help you? I do. Just don't fall in the trap of getting dragged down in the cesspool of Facebook or Twitter or whatever your social media vehicle of choice is.
Yeah. So speaking of more of that end of the spectrum, just out of curiosity, how do you handle social media and job searches? Like, when you have candidates on campus, do you check out what their what they've been writing on Facebook, or if they're involved in some of those other organizations? Have you ever used that, or how would you approach using those?
I'll speak for me. I'm a total stalker when it comes to that. I do use it. I want to see what you put up there. There's a Facebook group, I think it's Student Affairs Professionals Facebook group. And, I go on there sometimes and just shake my head about some of the things, some of the conversations and posts that happen there. And I know that many of my colleagues agree with that. So I do go on. I do put your name in the search engine and not just on Facebook or not just on Twitter, but in Google. I think many people do that now to sort of get an idea of what they're dealing with. And I think that that's not uncommon. So I think that knowing that, whether you think it's right or not, take that away from it. People do it. So if you know people are doing it, then it should give you pause to what you're putting out there in the cyber world.
Well, and I think it's tough because with kind of not just the connectivity of social media platforms, but the connectivity of one another professionally in housing, that stuff has a way of finding us. Even when you're not looking for it. So to that point, like discussions from Facebook groups, they show up in feeds if you're a member of them. And LinkedIn populates based upon oftentimes who searches for us. And keeping all of that in mind, for saying stuff on a public forum we're not ready to be asked about by a potential employer, we need to be questioning how we're engaging. And that's what I typically encourage people with is, if you're going to have the social media platforms as you're searching, for example, LinkedIn, either have it really well built and have it be great and public facing, or maybe don't have it at all.
Right.
If you're going to, if you're really active on a lot of those social media platforms, just be okay with the idea that if somebody were to see it or to share a tweet, or if you've had a discussion, because a lot of folks don't realize as they're engaging in these social media discussions, they're engaging in discussions with future potential employers.
It's not just in our field either. It's professional athletes, it's movie stars, it's actors, it's all that.
Yep. And I think that's what's tough is we have those things so blended, and that's going to be what it is. And folks can push back against that and say, but I don't want those things to be blended. Well, if it's out there, it is inevitably blended, and you have really no choice but to let that be what it is. I think it's tough because as folks are having maybe some really intense discussions, or they're putting things out there, to JB's point, that might not even be intended for the work that we do. They may decide a year from then to go work at an institution they had never thought about. And all of a sudden, that place they never thought they would work is like the most attractive employer they've ever seen. And there's this moment of like, do I have to do any backtracking as a result of that? And I think there's kind of a perfect world in which we as employers often know that people can absolutely engage in spirited discussion and people can absolutely put themselves out there, and that's great. And benefit of the doubt matters and the presumption of goodwill matters. At the same time, there's some pretty interesting stuff that's pushed out.
Right. And I think young professionals get frustrated that they can't have it both ways, which is, I want to be in the Wild West on this Facebook group discussion, but I don't ever want it to come back to haunt me in any way.
Well, and that's where it gets back to that idea, right, of am I willing to be accountable to the thing I posted? And if I'm willing to be accountable to it, and if the tough question is asked of me, or I'm willing to ask a tough question in an interview, I know I like that. Please ask a tough question.
Right.
Let's have the realistic discussion. Those have been some of my favorite interviews throughout the years is, let's talk about this thing that's going on your campus. And it's a great way to open the door to say, yeah, I am the kind of person who's willing to have the spirited, candid discussion. But you got to be willing to be accountable to it once it's out there.
Amen.
You raised some very excellent points. So thank you very much for sharing all of that. You shared earlier a couple of the social media platforms that you use. Could you just tell us why you use or have chosen certain platforms, and do you use them for different things?
I'll go, Chris. I use several platforms. I use Facebook to stay connected and share that. That's probably the one I'm on most. It keeps me connected to high school classmates or family members as well as professional members. I use Twitter more personally. I liked it a lot better when it was 140 characters instead of 280. I think anybody can say things in 280. I think you have to know a little bit to put something in 140 characters. So that's more personal for me, and it's real-time, live update sorts of things as opposed to Facebook, which is a little bit longer. And I use Snapchat and Instagram now. I don't use those as much. I think younger people are on both of those, but they don't really have the same impact that I want to make with social media that Twitter and Facebook allows me.
I used to be a huge Twitter proponent, and I still think it has its uses. I think to JB's point, when they expanded how much you put into it, you had to really think about how you coalesced an idea or an argument.
Right.
That was what I thought was really useful about it. But it became almost impossible to follow discussions, and I got really into using TweetDeck and really into managing all the feeds and the hashtags I was interested in. And then it became information overload, and it started to kind of distort itself. And all of that said, some of my best friends professionally, the people I trust the most and am the most connected to, were through Twitter. So it did some really incredible things for me. Now, it's primarily Facebook because I love the ability to have a thoughtful discussion over the course of 2 or 3 days. And for folks to be able to come back to things once they've had a time to think or time to respond. So it lets me come and go a little bit more freely. If you don't keep up with certain social media platforms, you lose followers and you lose the ability to show up the way that you used to.
Right. And
that just became a little bit more like a marathon. So I like the idea that I can kind of come and go with Facebook and it's not a huge deal. Though, for the time that I was using Twitter, it was really fantastic.
I loved old Twitter too. And I actually have connected with people on Twitter that I've never met in my life, that I've stayed connected with because we do share values or we do share interests. And I think that is a neat thing about the cyber world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would agree that I feel like it makes the world so much smaller. But I can also hear some of the concerns, and I know I've gone in and out a little bit, particularly depending on certain discussions or certain times a year where there was a period of time where I'm like, I got to keep up on the news of the day and what's going on. And then it got to the point where it just became this, I don't know if it was an echo chamber, but just more like, but I'm not keeping up, so I don't know what's going on. And it just got to the point where I'm like, I have other things that I need to do in my own life. So how do I step back and make other things a priority and take care of the things that I need to that are in front of me as well?
Absolutely.
So you both talked about this, but I wanted to see if you had anything to add about, what implications are you willing to accept based on what you've posted?
I assume if I've posted something that I could read it back to the president of the university and feel good about it. That's the standard I pick. I'm careful for that reason. I wouldn't post or discuss something that wasn't immediately ready to be discussed or stood behind. But if I'm really that passionate enough to post it publicly, that's probably already not a surprise to the people around me. Nobody's going to look at something I post that I'm passionate about most likely and say, gosh, I didn't know that was your interest, or I didn't know that's how you felt. That gets back to that congruence piece for me. I'm not going to accept the idea that something I post would call into question my ethics or integrity as a leader. So I use that train of thought as well, or it could even be interpreted that way. And like we'd been talking about before, it really gets back to the intent versus impact. So if it's important to me that folks see me as congruent. It's important to me that I can answer for the things that I did or that I posted. So I always try to keep that as my frame before I do things.
I tend to agree with Chris mostly. I'm probably a little less risk averse than he is, and I think that probably has to do with, I've been in this field 25 years, and so if you follow people that have been in the field longer, you see that they tend to be less risk averse maybe than young professionals that still have their whole career ahead of them that are being a little more cautious. Now, that being said, I don't try to get too crazy, but I think if I were a young professional, I'd probably see people like me and other people I know post and say, I wish I could post that. I couldn't get away with saying that, and because of positionalities. But I try not to get too cozy with it.
Well, to that point too, though, think of a lot of they're both spoken and unspoken, but a lot of the unspoken norms in our field, a lot of folks hear early in their career, be careful, this is a small field, be careful, things will come back to bite you, don't make mistakes, don't do these things. And that frankly really scares people. And I don't necessarily even think that's fully true. All of us have made mistakes. All of us have been prone to error. All of us have probably said or done things that we have probably backed off from later on. And when I think about what it's like for a young professional, oftentimes they're interpreting those messages, and then they're seeing oftentimes what mid to senior level folks are maybe doing on social media or at a conference, and they're comparing these messages and saying, but wait a second, if I do these things, I was told everyone's going to find out about them and no one's going to read my resume. But then I look over here and I see these people engaging freely. And the question then becomes, what messages are we sending to people, and do we look congruent?
Oh, they're incongruent, totally.
And that's where, I think of when I was a newer professional, that was a very real fear all of the time. What am I presenting as? What does this sound like? Am I going to be accountable to this later? Is everybody going to know that this mistake was made? And in reality, what nobody shared with it's a small field is, and we all make mistakes, and you're going to screw up. And anybody you meet in any profession that looks as if they haven't done any of those things, probably not realistic.
Well, I think that's an everyday problem with everyone that uses Facebook is a lot of people put their best face there, and behind the scenes, they're carrying a lot of weight and a lot of baggage like we all do every day. Nobody's living this Pollyanna Stepford Wives life. And so I think that's one of the dangers of Facebook is that it does message that everybody's leading this good life when everybody's carrying some weight, no matter how much it is. I think we got to be careful about that.
There's this really interesting thing in the tech world called FailCon, and it's actually an entire conference devoted to things that did not work and them sharing their failures because they can build off of that. And I think about that concept in the frame of student affairs and housing. We are just not taught to talk about things we messed up on. We're not taught to talk about our failures because we believe that if we don't do that, it'll perpetuate us forward oftentimes. And then you meet senior level professionals who are very willing to talk about those things. And there's something that happens in our career where our brain changes and we say, gosh, I'm a lot more comfortable talking about this thing that didn't work. A lot of that is positionality, quite frankly, and privilege. But I think that if we normalize some of that, that changes how people engage on social media. I would love to see posts every day about here's the 3 things I did that didn't work that I thought would. Or here's this initiative in housing that was amazing last year, failed miserably this year. Let's talk about it and talk about why. It normalizes all of us as being dynamic and both successful and unsuccessful at times.
What makes me laugh about that, Chris, is for the amount of people that talk about their want for authenticity and vulnerability in this field. They talk about it every day in this field. We sure let that go by the wayside on social media.
I mean, we don't normalize failure. And there's a heck of a lot of failure, especially in a business of people where we are all imperfect, and it's imperfect people serving imperfect people, oftentimes in crisis. And that's tough. Like, that's really, really tough. And that's when you talk about how did social media benefit us in the past. I found my very relatable group of fellow imperfect people, and we felt very comfortable talking about those things. But I wonder, how do we not change that a little bit? Hashtag I failed. I don't know.
But, it's funny. I was talking to a friend the other night, and getting ready to move, and sold their house, going to Florida, the new kid, everything on the outside going great, and then I get this private message from her, and she said, I'm alone. I don't know what direction I'm going in. And I said to her, I go, I would have never guessed that based on your news feed. I'm so sorry. And her response back to me was, fake it till you make it, right? I mean, and I think there's a lot of reality in that out there.
Well, and that's one of those other messages we hear, right? Fake it till you make it. And within that is admit no weakness. Like, that's really what that statement says, is don't admit you're struggling. And it becomes a very easy thing sometimes for us to say, and we don't think about what the implication of that means, especially for younger professionals. And you can see it sometimes where it's like, ooh, you're absolutely faking it. And right. How did we open the door for you to even be able to talk about it? And that's where I try to do the self-reflection piece of, did I do my part to normalize you talking about this thing that might not be going well?
Right. And how bad do you feel that you could be helping this person you care about, but you never knew?
Well, and that's where it would be good if we as a field really evaluated a lot of the kind of norms and the statements we use and how we have those conversations. Because a lot of what we could fix to help folks be successful would be just to rethink some of the foundational pieces of what we've been told since graduate school. And I think it's a good way for us to, and social media forces us to question these things, right? Because I've spoken with a lot of folks in social media who say, but this is the way the field is. We're told that these things matter more than these things, and we're told we need to be these kind of people. And my question is, well, where did you hear those things? Oh, well, I heard it from a mentor, or I heard it from a friend. And it's nothing that's written down, and it's just a candid conversation that didn't happen. And I'm the benefit of, befriending really candid people who want to have those conversations. But not everybody has those mentors or those friends to be able to do it. And that's very easy to forget about, because we can be at a conference and having a great time with one another. But as we're doing that, there may be other people, hanging around saying, why aren't I a part of that? Am I doing something wrong that I aren't benefited by that or afforded to it? And that's very real. And it's tough to be the person lonely at a conference. It's tough to be the person lonely in a field. And we have to wonder, both on and off social media, are we constructing that by accident? And not thinking about it. I don't know.
Potentially.
Well, that was a lot of rich conversation there. I mean, we could unpack a whole day around leadership and authenticity, and how do you give people, as leaders, I don't want to say give people permission to fail, but like saying failure is okay. How do you give people grace when mistakes have been made? And also the underlying messages around identity, and how identity matters and your cultural context matters, and where you are at an institution, and all that plays into even just being a leader. I mean, forget the social media piece for a moment. Like, all of that plays into how you interact and how you're showing up at work and how you're being involved, on a daily basis, let alone how you're showing up on a social media platform.
Well, Steph, I will tell you, I think grace and forgiveness are in short supply, not only in our field, but in this world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, and oftentimes people read our ability to allow them to make mistakes or to be comfortable with it by our first reaction. So if we say we're okay with mistakes and failure, and then it happens and we respond strongly, whether it be on or off social media, we didn't create the environment in which that was okay. And part of that is, well, okay, we're okay with mistakes and failure. We're not okay with ethical concerns. We're not okay with things that cross certain lines, but what are those lines, and did we talk about those openly and freely? And again, I'm the benefit of mentorship that did those things. But again, how do we have those conversations? And
yeah. Well, speaking of sort of boundaries, to kind of wrap in a couple of questions, because I know we're getting towards the end of our time, but just thinking about, like, do you have any red lines or boundaries in social media? And do you have any other best tips or best practices that you would want to share with folks for consideration?
As out there as I am and as risk averse as I am, I really, 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 to the extent that I can, try to avoid national politics. I will admit to a guilty pleasure of hammering some of our state politicians, because I think the state of Illinois is so bad that they deserve to be hammered publicly. And I think like 85% of the state of Illinois think that too, because it's a disaster. But I really, besides that, I really try to stay away from national politics, because I think it makes people crazy. And we have colleagues that dive right into the deep end of that. I've got many colleagues who I love and have shared drinks with and care about deeply, that are not afraid to dive right into the deep end of that politics pool. And I worry about that, because I think in any campus we're on, almost any campus, students we serve, not everybody believes what we believe politically. And so I think that we have to be careful about how we're putting ourselves out there. Are we available to them? If we really dive deep onto one side of it, they're on the other. I think we got to be really careful about that as we're on social media.
I won't post about what's going on at my or other universities. It's really easy for people to throw stones at other schools, but we're all on glass campuses ultimately. So when I see professionals repost kind of like a half-hearted, poorly written article, critiquing rather another university, it breaks my heart. It's not your phone that rings until it is. So I have a hard time watching that. As we become the leaders of universities, we've got to handle others with care and kindness, frankly. And I also keep in mind that we're all going to, if we choose to progress in this profession or choose to progress in our roles, we're going to be on the receiving end of a lot of that criticism or a lot of those reposts of articles. And I think we've all had enough experience to know, unless we know more, it's probably great just not to go down that road. That's not to say when things happen elsewhere, I won't talk to colleagues or mentors about it, because I will, and say, what's this all about? Let's talk about this. This matters. I typically won't perpetuate that on social media. Really, the grace we hope we're shown is the same grace and critical thought we should also be showing to peers at other institutions. Additionally, I won't post anything about specific college athletes. I struggle when I watch other student affairs folks critique a student athlete in their performance. They're students. They're the ones we're serving. And why would we ever take to social media to say they played a bad game? Trust me, they probably already know, and they're probably already hurting. The same would go for student government folks that maybe are really passionate about something. In our service of them, I also would not want to slight them. And it's, for me, those are things I won't do. And I feel for my colleagues who are oftentimes going through that, and I feel for those students. So
you ask about some advice, Seth. So I'd say a couple things I think about as we're wrapping up for advice. Everybody's watching. So if you're out there, you're in the Wild West, you should know you're in the Wild West. Accept the responsibility of knowing you're in the Wild West on social media. I would say there's a lot of good, I think, that can be used from social media. So if you can find those ways of good to do that, do it. That includes being positive about your university, your associations, fundraising, reconnecting with others. And some ones I think everybody knows but should be reinforced is don't drink and drive and don't drink and post. They're bad ideas.
Echoing all of that, and maybe as an add-on, find your people and move forward. Social media can absolutely outlive its usefulness. And that's an okay thing. It's okay to say, this has been cool, I've enjoyed it, it's been great, I'm moving on from it. And it's not as important as it was. All of that is fine. But it's almost as if we need to be given permission or give ourselves permission to move on from it, which is also a whole nother thing we could unpack. But it's okay to say, hey, I've established these relationships and I'm pretty comfortable with that.
Yeah.
There you go.
Great. Well, I want to thank both of you. This was a great conversation. I think you two are just stunning professionals and have offered a lot of value and service to the association and to all of our colleagues. So I really appreciate all the time that you took today out of your busy days to talk a little bit more about two people who I think have really sort of embraced social media, but also have some really thoughtful things to say about boundaries and expectations and about just sort of how we approach it moving forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you.